Hey, it's Rachel Cooke, your modern mentor. I'm the founder of Lead Above Noise, a firm specializing in activating workplaces, helping you discover ways to amplify performance and employee engagement together. We do leader boot camps, keynotes, and pulse checks. Just let us know what you need. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of sharing an interview that I did with Vijay Pendakur. Dr. Vijay Pendakur is a principal and founder of Vijay Pendakur Consulting. He's held corporate roles in such companies as Salesforce and Dropbox, and was Dean of Students at Cornell University. In this episode, we discuss his new book, The Alchemy of Talent, Leading Teams to Peak Performance. In this conversation, we cover a ton of ground on what really unlocks the best of ourselves in our teams. Vijay is funny and insightful and not squeamish about some uncomfortable topics. I hope you enjoy the listen. Vijay Pendakur, did I get it right?
You did.
I did. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Modern Mentor podcast. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Can't wait to have this conversation with you, Rachel.
Awesome. So, Vijay, I actually had reached out to you because a very dear friend of mine had the great pleasure of seeing you deliver a keynote speech in her organization, and she was just blown away by your thought, by your charisma, by your energy, by your intelligence. And she pointed me to you, and you so graciously agreed to be here today. So a little bit of a fangirl moment happening here, but it is a pleasure.
That's really humbling. I hope to live up to the high bar that's been set.
I mean, I hope so too. So fingers crossed. I jest. So Vijay, you were here, you started off being here as a keynote speaker and a team effectiveness coach, but we are now ready to add author to that list of nouns that are following you around. Many congratulations to you on the new book, The Alchemy of Talent. I had the great opportunity to give it a little bit of a pre-read. I just thought it was fantastic, and I am so excited to dive into some of that today. Before we get to some of the sort of nuts and bolts of the work you do, can you give us just the really short story on how you landed in the position that you are in today? What has driven you to this point in your career?
Sure thing. I'll give you the cliff notes. So I have been obsessively curious about the relationship between environments and human performance for as long as I can remember. And I think partially that was because of growing up in the environment I grew up in. My parents are immigrants. They moved to North America in the 1960s. I ended up growing up right at the northern edge of the city of Chicago. My neighborhood was primarily Black, primarily low income. Me and my sister are, immigrant Indian children in this neighborhood. And everything from the war on drugs, mass incarceration, Reaganomics, had a huge impact on my daily experience of life. And that environment shaped the way that I related to myself, the people around me, school, achievement. And so when I was lucky enough to go off to college, I was already curious about the relationship between environments and performance. And that led me into a career as a social scientist, an academic, and a university administrator that took me across 5 universities in almost every time zone in the United States as first and foremost a university administrator looking at the relationship between student environments and academic performance. And then in a second chapter of my career, I moved that same skill set and thinking and data orientation into looking at employee environments and employee performance. And there's an amazing Venn diagram overlap here between the idea of the student experience and what levers we have, what data we have, what tactics improve that, and what carries over into the employee experience in complex organizations. And I worked at a number of global companies in VP and C-level roles, and then moved to being a keynote speaker and team effectiveness coach. And then I have a book coming out, and now I'm talking with you.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's so interesting. I think it was Steve Jobs who said something in that really famous Stanford commencement speech, and I'm going to misquote, but something to the effect of, we can only connect the dots in the rear view, right? Not necessarily looking forward. And so as you think about where you are today and you think about those different moments in your story, in hindsight, it makes absolutely perfect sense that you'd be sitting where you are. So congratulations.
Well, thank you.
So, I'd love to talk a little bit about, you and I teed up some topics we want to cover, and I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm going to go off script a little bit here, and then
Okay.
but I'm really curious because you made that interesting comment about looking at the student or the academic environment and then academic performance and how that sort of parlays itself into the workplace. What I'm curious about, reflecting on my own university experience and how unbelievably relevant the physical space around us was, the real kind of face-to-face connections, all of that, et cetera. How does all of your experience in that realm translate to your thoughts and feelings right now on the virtual and hybrid world of working?
Oh, let's start with the light question.
The
ones with the easy answers. Well, so I think I have a very bimodal response to this current moment. On one hand, I see a tremendous opportunity to include people who have historically been structurally excluded from knowledge work based on where they live, who they're taking care of in their life, and other kinds of structural constraints, right? So this is a massive opportunity to expand the pie of who gets these lucrative, stable jobs with good benefits, who gets ushered into the middle class, who gets to generate generational wealth for their family, right? And I am all for that. Let's expand the pie of human opportunity. And the other modal, the other side of me is really concerned about the other reality, which is I'll first express this as a human and second as a behavioral scientist. As a human, I would not have the life I have the thinking I have the experiences I have, the competencies, the skills, if it wasn't for in-person on-site work. In-person on-site education in a university, the dynamic experience of having to make things work when I wasn't comfortable, not being able to hit leave session, and have to figure out how to come of age in that environment. And who am I? How do I relate? How do I reskill? How do I pick myself up when I've fallen apart? Hugely important. And then in the world of work, everything from like my best friends in life have come that I didn't make through growing up, have come through work, right? Proximity and coffee club, lunches, let's walk around, and, oh my gosh, can I pop into your office? I think I just might have tanked that meeting, like all the things, right? And then celebrating, and engagements and baby showers and all of this stuff that the times that I've tried to do similar things on virtual in the last 4 years have felt like a shadow of what they should be. And so as a human, I worry about disconnection, isolation, languishing. It's a word you're going to hear me use a lot in our conversation. Humans have a deep desire, hardwired into us, for everything from eye contact to physical contact. And you really cannot argue with that evolutionary biology. Part of that was getting fed at work. And so we have to then figure out what our strategy for connection and relatedness is in the new world of work. So I'm not saying that, we just have to go back to 5 days a week on site. But if organizations are going to choose hybrid or remote, then what is your playbook to replace this key variable that actually drives human performance, right? Connection isn't a feel-good vibe. It's a performance ROI. And we can talk more about that if you want. But the number of organizations and teams I work with that have moved into a new way of work that represents a fundamental shift from where they were for decades. And then I say, how has every team leader been reskilled in order to lead teams like this? And there's crickets. So if we're going to do this, we have to acknowledge that it's a sea change and actually reskill in order to support some kind of successful outcomes in this new way of work.
It's really, really beautifully said. A much more articulate version of what I think of as my own perspective, which is there is no simple answer. There's a really strong case to be made in both directions. And we have to acknowledge that and accept that we haven't solved it yet, but stop just playing tug of war around it. I think that's kind of what I'm taking away. I would love, though, to go down that path that you teed up and said we could go down there if I want to, because I do. So, I would love to talk a little bit more about the linkage between, and I talk to clients about this all the time, right? We have a real focus and rigor around performance and performance management. A lot of organizations have a really rigorous process around employee engagement and an engagement survey. One is really about performance and one is really about kind of feeling and sentiment. And what we haven't really, the nut we haven't cracked in organizations yet is the understanding that those things can and should exist in a flywheel, right? Mm-hmm. When we are doing engagement right, it's not about pizza parties and bagels on Fridays and yoga and massage, but when we actually enable our teams, when we set them up for performance success and we do help them connect and set boundaries and all of these things, they are able to perform more effectively, which drives their sense of engagement, which drives their ability to perform, etc. I'm talking at you about your own expertise, but I would love to get a bit of how do you talk about this? How do you think about this? And how do you simplify this with your clients? Because you know that's something you've done really well.
Well, plus 100 to what you're saying. So I think that a radically simple flywheel is necessary in the employee experience space right now. Just like everything in this mass media moment, we actually have communication pollution. We actually have too much. And part of what is helpful in spaces where we have more models and data points and heuristics and that than any human can possibly hold is to actually go with radical simplicity as a design concept, less is more as a commitment, right? And so when I'm talking with talent leaders in an organization and I say, talk to me about your EX strategy, and they go, great, we have this grid. Let me pull it up for you. I'm going to share screen. It's 7 rows by 7 columns. I'm like, I'm just weeping, right? I'm like metaphysically weeping. There's a part of my brain that's like waiting for 5 p.m., So it's just too much, right? What is the less is more on this? And I think you started to sketch some of this out. We've got performance management where there's a really heavy investment in corporations right now. But if we're going to be really honest about what that investment is, it's in the evaluation. It's in the precise evaluation of the work that has been done in order to do a couple of things: reward high performers and to coach up or coach out low performers. That's fine. That's part of talent density. That's part of org hygiene. I'm okay with that. But performance management is different than performance cultivation, right? And so performance cultivation is the leading indicators. How do we get on the front end of this? And so what you see on the performance cultivation side is a lot of incoherence, right? So we've got almost any scaled organization has some kind of employee listening, but that employee listening has not been put into a logic model. So what factors are we asking after, and why those factors? How do they linearly translate into our performance model, right? And so I've been part of organizations that have 10 items on their biannual employee listening survey, and part of organizations that have 60 items on their biannual employee listening survey. And I saw your grimace there. I don't know, our listeners might not be able to see Rachel's, sad, I'll pass face, but the 60 items didn't hold water for our host, right? And it doesn't for me either, because we're trying to boil the ocean, and 60 items signals an obsession with data rather than an obsession with impact. And so how do we go to less is more? Well, it helps to have a couple of things. So one thing I think is important to bring forward is clarity around the fact that the team is the unit of performance in complex organizations. The team is the unit of performance. And what I mean by that is when you look at performance management, it's about individuals. But individuals don't actually generate the performance outcome for the business. Teams do. And you know this because you can take someone who's a high performer and put them on a dysfunctional team, and it lowers their performance. So actually, a better place to put your calories is around team analytics and team effectiveness. And then you start to, so what we're doing is delimiting, right? We're delimiting down into what are we going to pay attention to, because we cannot pay attention to everything. And when you start to think about team analytics, then you can think about team health dashboards and what matters most on a team. Well, a couple of things show up. One is leader effectiveness. We go back to the old adage, people don't leave bad jobs. They leave bad leaders or bad managers. And I know that. I've lived that. You probably have lived that, right? The leader has an outsized impact on the team's performance and on individual employee sentiment. So the hill to die on in employee experience is leader effectiveness, first and foremost, and then secondly, team skills. So how do we reskill the team? I would say 3 variables that completely outpunch their weight class around that connection, that through line you were pointing to between sentiment and performance, so that it's not hand wavy, feel good vibes, but it's actually about ROI. 3 variables that show up over and over and over again in the behavioral science research on high performing teams is trust, or safety is another way of reframing that, belonging, and connection, which calls back to our opening conversation, right, on relatedness. And when team members and team leaders know how to foster and sustain the flywheel of trust, belonging, and connection, they're actually able to sustain a high performance team in a world that is serving them an unlimited buffet of disruption and volatility. Those are the variables that actually are purpose built and purpose aligned to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. VUCA, right? Our new normal.
There is a lot in there. There's a lot to unpack. I'm sold 100%. I work in a lot of corporations that, they are public. They report out to the street. They have to show quarterly results. And sometimes in my experience, some of these things like trust and belonging, they can feel soft. They can feel squishy. They can also take longer than a quarter to sort of prove their efficacy in terms of results and impact. And so I'm curious, because you have actual research behind this, how do you talk to leaders in the organizations you work with in a way that convinces them this is the place to invest dollars, but also time and consideration?
Yeah. A couple of things. So one, as a social scientist, I'm deeply committed to psychological safety as the foundation of a good house, right? And a team, if you imagine a team as a house, that base layer is critical, and psychological safety is the base layer. It is the linear ROI to performance shows up over and over and over again, but even secondary factors in terms of talent retention, talent attraction, all of that kind of stuff. And I have learned the hard way by messing this up that it's better to talk about it as trust than psychological safety. Now, the true behavioral science heads in the audience right now are going, well, technically those are different factors. Yes, 100%. I get it. And when I use the language of trust with business leaders who I'm engaged with, just like you, publicly held companies, globally distributed, very complex organizations, I talk about trust, they all go, yeah, that makes sense. Trust is actually one of our company values. Trust shows up in some form in almost every company value because it's key. If you're B2B, it's key. If you're B2C, it's key. And so then when you create this team effectiveness variable that ladders up to a company value, it's much easier, right, to evangelize an investment. I can also linearly show the math. And the other thing I talk about with talent leaders or team leaders that are trying to create change in their organizations is that we actually have to show the math. As a parent of 2 young kids, this is a common phrase, right? How did you get from point A to point B? Well, on trust, we know that trust drives the behaviors of high-performing teams in these ways. And I'll pull forward something like healthy conflict. And most business leaders that I am engaged with recognize that conflict is essential for innovation and ideation processes. I can easily show them why low-trust teams avoid conflict, accrue conflict debt, right, to quote Leon Davey, and then they miss that really beautiful space right up near the horizon where the high-performing team starts to leverage conflict as a flywheel of innovation and iron sharpening iron on the solutioning side. Business leaders get that. They want healthy conflict. What they often haven't seen is the math on how trust unlocks healthy conflict. Same thing, belonging. Your belonging just screams hand wavy, feel good vibes and swag bags and like employee parties, right? So I think it's really important to find a way to localize and contextualize the variable into the lingua franca of your company, right? And so that might mean that we talk about affinity, right? So we might be using the variable of belonging, but we might say employee affinity. What is employee affinity? It's the employee's sense of being proud of where they work, feeling seen by their leader and understood by their leader, feeling connected to their peers and being supported to have a career, not a job. I'm using Coquel's definition of belonging there, seen, proud, connected, supported, right? But reframing that in ways that a talent leader can evangelize to a business leader, or a team leader can evangelize to their direct manager, to say, instead of talking about the power of belonging, to say, look, I want my employees to have affinity in this organization. Here's how we would go about doing that. So part of what I do when I'm coaching intact teams or working at the executive layer is I repackage the behavioral science into business math. And this is, I think, something that HR has not done a great job of, and particularly some of the centers of excellence like DEI and L&D and social impact that have left the math as do this because it's the right thing to do. And we can no longer afford that kind of value proposition.
I think that was unbelievably well said. I completely agree with all of it. I think, a couple of the pieces that are really standing out to me are this idea that, math matters, but words matter also. But sometimes it's not necessarily about using the right words by their technical definition. It's about using the language that will resonate with the client, with the team that you're looking to work with. I have always said, I think psychological safety is one of the most intelligent and simple concepts I've ever encountered. And yet I think it needs a rebrand in the corporate world because it sounds like you're heading into a therapy session, which no leader wants to be thinking about with their team. The concept is important, but how we talk about it so that people feel comfortable being with it in a workplace, I think is really important. And so some of what you were saying about affinity, same thing. And I think even on the DEI front, to your point about how we've approached it in organizations, and you are super welcome to disagree with me, but I think that part of where we have gone wrong in that realm, part of why I think we are struggling broadly to make the strides that I wish we had made by now, is driven by the fact that there's been a little bit too much of either, do it because it's the right thing, but also we've done it in a way that I think has left people feeling sort of blamed or accused for things that happened perhaps before they were even born. And I think it's really just about reframing the conversation around, how does it support business outcomes? And also, how do we all get to participate in these initiatives? How do we make it less a finger pointing and blaming conversation and more a belonging conversation? How are we all in this together? So I think there's some opportunity in there.
Yes. I mean, so one, I think that you've got a good read on some of the challenge areas. Let me expand, having been in the trenches in some of these roles. And I think that one place I'd like to start is in this current moment we're in. The analog I can think of is right now, there's a pretty heavy emphasis on the space race, right? Getting satellites into space, getting a Mars mission going, getting rockets going to the International Space Station. And every 6 to 8 weeks, there is a misfire of some sort. That misfire might be something catastrophic that literally happens during the launch, or it might be a misfire in the prep for a launch and a launch delay, or a missed promise to shareholders that we miss a beat, right? And we have to push the entire milestone back a quarter. No one is looking at these tactical mistakes and saying we should stop exploring space as a result of these tactical mistakes. Nobody is taking the reality that in extremely complex multivariable situations, the tactical mistakes are guaranteed, and using that to then dismantle the need for the entire phenomenon in the first place. The analogy would be that if a shuttle launch fails, we say, you know what? Space exploration was foolish in the first place. That's what's happening with DEI right now. and I think it's I would be remiss if I didn't name that there is an asymmetric backlash to tactical errors happening right now. The tactical errors are replete, right? But there's tactical errors in everything. I mean, there's tactical errors in world-class publicly held companies releasing an advertisement for a new product that offends its entire base, and then they have to retract the advertisement and issue an apology, as we saw with Apple and their iPad advertisement recently. Nobody said in the face of that tactical error that we should then stop making the iPad. And so I do want to name that there's a power asymmetry and a clapback asymmetry right now that is disproportionate to the number of tactical errors. And it would also be remiss of me to not name that there are lots of tactical errors in the DEI space. So what are those, right? I think there's a couple. One is erring on the side of performative DEI investments rather than systemic and structural. So a quick example of that is spending a huge chunk of the budget on some celebrity speaker and a day-long activation where underserved, marginalized peoples and their allies feel really good coming out of that day. And nothing changed in terms of pay equity, job pathing, number of people making it into the director plus level, toxic managers being worked out of the workplace. These are the things that people, all humans need, particularly people from vulnerable communities. There's a lot of that. There was a lot of that. I do want to also name, though, that many times it was not the DEI practitioners pushing for that. It was actually the business leadership and the employee base pushing for that, because those are the things that make you feel really good really quickly. And there was many, many DEI practitioners in closed door conversations saying what we need to do is audit the employee life cycle and bring data and rigor to these processes to reduce bias and noise, and getting nowhere with it, not getting the support, So performativity is there. It needs to shift. I think the other thing around, can we repackage the value proposition of this so that everyone can find a win for themselves? That's a must. That's a must. And I agree with you that framing this as socially reparative inside for-profit companies is a dead end. And that's my hot take for our time together today. For-profit companies have one mission: to make profit. And anything that is not aligned to that mission may exist for a moment, but it's going to be the first to go when times get tough, when there's headwinds, when there's friction. And so when the huge mistake of DEI was to frame this as socially reparative, as opposed to framing this as consistently, rigorously, and in evidence-based ways as a business imperative. And then finding things like belonging as a driver for team performance and resilience as an on-ramp to get everybody leaned in to wanting this to be their employee experience, rather than sort of over-indexing on identity-specific plays that elevated certain identity experiences within the company discourse. And inadvertently, I don't think this was purposeful, but inadvertently left another group going, what's in it for me? And if you leave a large portion of your workforce asking the question, what's in it for me? You probably don't have a sustainable strategy or tactic.
Oof. Yes. Is that an appropriate response? There is a tremendous amount in there. And I think you and I are very, very aligned. You are just more articulate than I am. Here's what I would love to do, though. I want to pull some of the threads that I think we've already started. So we have talked about the importance of diversity and belonging, not just from a feels good, nice to have point of view, but there is a tremendous amount of evidence that shows that diverse teams perform more effectively, they drive more innovation, et cetera. We've talked about belonging. We've talked about psychological safety. And I believe that there is research that shows psychological safety is the top performer, or certainly was at one time, of high performing teams, right? So where there is a diverse set of perspectives, voices, and backgrounds coming to the table, and these perspectives feel safe enough to speak up, to share ideas, to experience conflict in a way that is respectful and from a place of trust, there are links to performance that are undeniable.
Yeah.
What I would love to learn a bit from you is around, how do you coach teams and leaders to do this? How do we turn these ideas and high concepts into actionable strategies that somebody can pick up and implement tomorrow?
Sure. Well, one, I just want to say I love your synopsis, because it's such a great synopsis of the Alchemy of Talent, right? The book that comes out in September is this basic logic model, which is the first thing you need to bake onto any high-performing team is complexity, which is a repackaging of diversity. Complexity will drive the innovation flywheel, because you get then the friction that complexity produces, and friction unlocks anti-fragility. So there's a whole interesting chapter on the relationship between diversity, complexity, friction, and anti-fragility as the antecedent, right? The precursor to high-performing teams. And then to keep the alchemical metaphor going, right? You take that precursor and you add in the catalysts. And the catalysts are psychological safety or trust, right? Belonging and connection. So and when you do that, those catalysts actually unlock the power of friction and generate a team that outperforms consistently, especially in volatility and uncertain times. So what does that mean in terms of leader behavior, right? Leader behavior is my bailiwick. This is where I spend the majority of my time with clients. So for example, we'll pick one, right? When it comes to leader behavior around trust, oftentimes leaders say, I've read a little bit in Harvard Business Review on Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. It sounds really nice. I don't know what to do. And so there's a whole playbook in the book, right? But two things I can pull forward that I think are really easy. One is when you're managing a team in uncertainty, which actually many leaders these days feel like they are leading through a change. A leader who can name the unknowns frequently actually earns trust. And this is counterintuitive to many leaders because they feel like they should have all the answers. But the reality is, when you're leading through change, you don't have all the answers, and your team desperately wants you to have all the answers. And so you end up in this dissonance where the team is expecting you to speak to the key questions of, hey, when will the uncertainty end? When will the M&A close? Are we going to have another riff? Those kinds of things. And you don't have answers to that. But if you avoid naming the elephant in the room, which is these unknowns that are on people's hearts and minds, you actually lower trust. And so what I coach leaders to do is on a regular cadence, once every few weeks, once a month, depending on the intensity of the uncertainty, once a week if necessary, say, hey team, here are 2 or 3 things that I know are top of mind for you because it's coming up in one-on-ones, or I'm seeing it in our Slack or Teams chat group, right? Let me speak to this. When will the deal close? Or what is there going to be another riff? I want to let you know, I do not have an answer to those questions. I have these same questions. This has an unbelievable effect on raising trust on the team. And you might, when we're coaching leaders, Rachel, they're like, well, why wouldn't the team assume that if I had answers, I would share it with them? And assuming positive intent is what goes down during periods of volatility and uncertainty. So you cannot lean back on the way we operate out of our best selves when your team is under strain and in a moment of disruption. And so you actually have to know that they're going to lean in the direction of, we haven't heard from Rachel in 4 to 6 weeks about these key questions. I bet you she has answers and she is hoarding that information, and trust starts to drop. Very simple thing. Name the unknowns. So 3-word phrase, easy to hang on to when you as the leader are under stress. And then the second very actionable tip is around avoid performative listening. So oftentimes when you're leading through disruptive moments, change, loss of trust, and you're trying to rebuild trust, I've talked with a lot of teams who have experienced a riff in the last 12 to 18 months. And in the ones who survive, who are still at the company, they have to now, the lead team leader, the talent team, the people team, they have to rebuild trust in the organization. What they do in an effort to try and rebuild trust is they hold listening sessions for key decisions that are actually already made. And it is the fastest way to erode trust is to ask people to come into a room and ask them for their opinions on decisions that are made. Don't do that. Adults know that they don't get to make every decision in the organization. Be really clear and candid about when decisions are made. When decisions aren't made and there's a chance for input, absolutely go seek input. But performative listening is gathering people around and saying, I want to hear what you think about product strategy. If the product strategy is already baked or the OKRs are set, the number of times that I have been invited in to offer my perspective on whether the OKRs are realistic, and the whole team goes, this is not realistic. And then the L1 person goes, oh, okay, well, these were already ratified by the CEO and the board. Then you go, why were we here? Right? Okay, now I don't trust you, So you've hurt morale. So those are 2 quick things. Avoid performative listening, name the unknowns. Do this, don't do that.
So Vijay, thank you for that. I think that there is a lot of intelligence there for managers as they're continuing to wade through just this pervasive, consistent, everything is changing, everything is uncertain, everyone is exhausting, right? And I think really, really great advice in there. So I have one more question I want to ask you before we wrap up. I know that for me, so I have been running my business now for about 10 years. And one of the things that I specialize in is helping leaders lead through change. I've been working in change leadership, change management for quite some time. And I feel like the biggest change that we've seen in the realm of change is just how much constant chaos and uncertainty there is. We're heading down a path, we get disrupted, we have to turn left, we have to turn right. There are always a million things we don't know. This is what you just kind of addressed. And I'm wondering if you are experiencing the same and how you are helping leaders find their way through all of that.
I'm seeing the same thing as you, 100%, Rachel, and living it, right? I mean, we know this as people. It doesn't have to be some sort of obscure science data thing. Look at the number of changes we've lived through just in the last 4 years. Geopolitical unrest, macroeconomic disruption, supply chain shocks, now generative AI, right? I mean, I'm just naming a few of the things. And something that I frequently find myself revisiting with team leaders, HR executives, corporate, CFO, CEO, CIO groups is that we have underestimated the role of change readiness in our company success playbook. And partially that comes from a misunderstanding of humans' ability to navigate change. And a conversation I have a lot with executives, particularly, is this. I was at a dinner actually recently with a group of executives, and one said to me, if change is the new normal, why can't people just move more quickly towards that change acceptance, right? And partly what I had to do was unpack the neuroscience of how we experience change as people, and this you cannot get around, right? We are evolutionarily hardwired to experience large changes that we don't have control over as a threat. And when our limbic systems, the system that controls our fight, flight, freeze response, receives a threat signal, we experience a flush of various neurochemicals in our body, one of which is cortisol, another of which is adrenaline. And these things are really helpful for us historically when we were perceiving big threats and needing to evade the hungry cave bear, right? Or fight off a faction trying to take our food. In the world of work, not so helpful when we experience these state changes and we end up having this limbic overwhelm over and over and over again, so that you get enough fight, flight, freeze moments that result in the team and the individual languishing. When you get enough cortisol dump, you actually start to see in the research on individuals and living through volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, VUCA, which I know is a term you don't like saying, but I like saying, because I actually find it kind of cathartic to be like, oh, yesterday was so VUCA. But when you look at the neuroscience research labs and the studies of people, you actually can see the neurochemicals that are associated with wellness and performance over time as we move into a state of cognitive hijacking. And so there is a real strong body of evidence that we actually have to reskill leaders to help their teams navigate the change curve successfully. Otherwise, people become stuck, and they become stuck in ways that are really unproductive. They're unproductive at the team level, and they aggregate up to diminish productivity in the long run. And you're actually seeing this in the workforce, right? There's some big picture data around productivity per worker, and a lot of that trend line points down over in the last 10 to 15 years. You're also seeing data points. Gartner does a study annually. In 2016, they started asking this question: how willing are you as a worker to support an enterprise change, big change at the company level? That willingness factor has dropped by nearly 30 percentage points over 7 years of studying that phenomenon. So what I do with business leaders is bring forward this kind of data to say, if we don't have a change readiness investment, if we're not reskilling team leaders to inject resilience and agility into the team through a set of very specific purpose-built VUCA leadership skills, VUCA leadership toolboxes, then we are waiting for our employees to become stuck and then for productivity to drop. And that's a conversation that I would love to stop having, because we actually move to a place where companies adopt a change readiness strategy and set of tactics. We reskill leaders to lead through VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, because we do know that that is the new normal, right? There are a number of macro factors that point to the rate of disruption and the rate of change increasing over time. And that's not within our control. What is within our control is the ability to invest in team leadership and team effectiveness that's purpose built for endless disruption and uncertainty.
Really, really well said. I think there are three things that I really pull out of that. The first is that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, change, these are not going away. So we cannot outrun them. We have to learn to live with them. Number two, organizations need to invest in their leaders and their leaders' ability to help their teams through these things. And number three, what you didn't say, but what I'm hearing is we have to stop shaming people who don't love change. This does not make you a bad person. This is hardwired into us.
Yeah.
And so let's just own it and build the skills around it and stop being so evaluative around people that are naturally change resistant.
Yeah, I love that last point. I love that you're pulling that forward. I've had a hard time adjusting to changes that I wanted in my life.
Totally.
Right? You know, I moved across the country for a job I was super excited about, and then I experienced a mild depression after that move. I wanted children, had them, and then freaked out at being a parent. You know, I mean, so if we have a hard time wrestling with big changes in our life that we desire, what about the ones that we don't desire?
Absolutely. Whew. Well, Vijay, this has been an unbelievably compelling, useful, helpful conversation. I have enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you for being here, for being present. I just want to remind everybody about your book, The Alchemy of Talent. Tell me the second piece of that again.
Leading teams to peak performance.
Leading teams to peak performance. It is outstanding. It is action-oriented, and I hope everybody picks up a copy.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been fantastic having this conversation with you, and I look forward to more chances to connect in the future.
Absolutely. Stay tuned. Take care, Vijay.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Vijay Pendakur. Grab a copy of his new book, The Alchemy of Talent, Leading Teams to Peak Performance, wherever books are sold. Join me next week for another great episode. Until then, visit my website at leadabovenoise.com if your workplace could use an activation boost, a boot camp, a keynote, a pulse check, you choose. You can follow Modern Mentor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Find and follow me on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for listening and have a successful week. Modern Mentor is a quick and dirty tips podcast. It's audio engineered by Dan Farabend. Our director of podcasts is Brandon Getchus. Our podcast and advertising operations specialist is Morgan Christensen. Our digital operations specialist is Holly Hutchings. Our marketing and publicity associate is Davina Tomlin.